and was sentenced to something unbelievable in this day and age, and that is crucifixion. Sentenced to crucifixion.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. We start with a few pictures from a December 10th rally in New York City against hatred of Muslims and in support of refugees and the Syrian people. In some quarters, blind hatred is growing, but also opposition, including this living menorah from Jewish Voice for Peace in New Haven. A few weeks back, we showed a demonstration in Harvard Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts, against the U.S.-Saudi alliance and Saudi Arabia's war against Yemen, which so far has claimed 6,000 lives. That same night, which coincidentally was the night of the attack and massacre in Paris, Medea Benjamin and Rabah Al-Taibani spoke at a local Cambridge church. It was all sponsored by the Coalition to End the U.S.-Saudi Alliance.
I think it's great that we're coming together to talk about a country that we need to start educating other Americans about and build a movement. But I just want to take a moment before we start to think about where we are today. I just came back last night from Lebanon, having gone to the Syria border to see the conditions of the Syrian refugees there, and heard just horror stories from so many people about their loved ones being killed. And then as soon as I left the country, there were the bombings in Lebanon. And if you haven't looked at the news today, you'll see the bombings in Paris that have killed, according to some reports, upwards of 60 people. So let's just take a moment to think about people who are really suffering all over the world. Policies that our government has contributed to, and that have left a situation where there's no easy answers about how to unravel this mess at this point. But we know one of the pieces of the mess is the U.S.-Saudi alliance. And it's interesting. One of the issues I went to Lebanon for was to talk to people about the interest of having a women-led march to the border of Syria with women all over the world, particularly women who have suffered firsthand from a lot of this violence to come together. And we talked about women whose children had joined the U.S. military and perhaps been killed in the line of duty. Russian women whose loved ones were now involved in Syria. Women whose sons had joined ISIS for one reason or another. And as we talked about all of this, the women started getting excited about doing this together. But they also said, make sure this is not a substitute for your work back home, because your real work back home is getting the U.S. military out of the Middle East and to educate your own people about how much of the mess of ISIS was caused by your government's intervention in Iraq in the first place, and then the series of interventions that has happened after that in places like Libya. But they also brought up the issue of Saudi Arabia and said, how is it that the American people don't recognize how dangerous it is for the U.S. to be so allied with the most repressive country in the Middle East? So let's take a minute to talk about how repressive Saudi Arabia is. And hopefully part of our work tonight is to talk about how we start building around this. You can take so many issues to talk about Saudi Arabia. Where does one start? Perhaps start with the name, Saudi Arabia. It's a clan, it's a family's name. It's as if we were called, our country was called Trump. It is a family that has appropriated a country. They don't allow people to have political parties. They don't allow people to have elections at the national level. It's a large family in control and holding the lid by a couple of things. One, when the Arab Spring broke out and they realized, there might be more opposition inside Saudi Arabia, one of the things they did was to spread more money around. And when the price of oil was upwards of over $100 a barrel, they had a lot of money to spread around. And just as we saw a Saudi young man on the street in Harvard Square, we knew all his expenses were being paid for by the Saudi government because they pay for all the students that want to go overseas and get an education. I mean, they spread money around, and part of that is to buy allegiance. The other thing they did was to increase the repression, crack down on people who were questioning the monarchy. Some of us have been working on some individual cases, but those individual cases are indicative of the larger system of repression. For example, the case of Raif Badawi, a young man who had a blog that was simply talking about issues of democracy. And for that indiscretion, he was sentenced to 10 years in jail and 1,000 lashes that were supposed to be meted out in chunks of 50 lashes every Friday after prayer to go down to a public place and beat up this young man. And they did it once, and the world got to see because there was a video that leaked out. And people started organizing and questioning and pressuring, and thank goodness they haven't repeated the flogging. But the guy is still in jail for 10 years. He has a wife and 3 young children. Well, the message was not only, don't you dare blog about democracy, but his lawyer, who is representing him in this very medieval Saudi court system, was then sentenced himself to 10 years in prison. And when he was asked to recant and didn't do it, they upped it to 15 years in prison. There's another case that's gotten a lot of attention recently, and that's the case of a young man, Ali al-Nimr. Shia, Saudi Arabia is a majority Sunni population. The Shia are discriminated against, and this young man was part of protest movement, nonviolent protest movement against the treatment of the Shia. And for that, he was arrested at the age of 17, a juvenile, and went through this very Byzantine court system and was sentenced to something unbelievable in this day and age, and that is crucifixion. Sentenced to crucifixion. And when I called my Saudi friends, I said, what does that mean? He said, well, it means they first cut his head off, and then they pin the body up on a cross. These are our friends, the Saudis. Now, American citizens were shocked and disgusted when we saw the beheadings that ISIS was doing. And it is disgusting. But why aren't we shocked and disgusted by the fact that Saudi Arabia is really the ones that teach this kind of method? They've done over 100 beheadings already this year, and they do it in public. They do it in a place called the Chop Chop Square, where people can come out and watch this. So this is the kind of repressive measures that the Saudi government has taken to quell any discontent, any potential uprising like the Arab Spring. There's also the issue of women's rights in Saudi Arabia. It's the only country in the entire world where women aren't even allowed to drive. And there were some women that started a campaign for Saudis driving, and ask people around the world to do little videos of themselves in a car and beep the horn and say, I support Saudi women's right to drive. Well, for that, the women who organized it were put on trial as terrorists for trying to get women the right to drive. Well, the right to drive is just one thing. You name it. It's the right to have your children stay with you in the case of a divorce, right to inheritance, a right to make major decisions about your life without having a male having to give a stamp of approval for those decisions. Repression of the entire female population who are treated as second-class citizens. The issue, I mentioned freedom of religion, that you have to be a Muslim, that the Shia are discriminated against. But what about the issue of the extreme kind of Islam that the Saudis spread, not only internally, but spread around the world? The Wahhabist extremist ideology. If you look at the billions of dollars that the Saudis are spending to create these madrasas around the world where young people are taught this kind of extremism. Well, is it any wonder that the extremism then is spreading around the Middle East, Northern Africa? Is it any wonder that you find Saudi money behind the extremism? Whether you're talking about the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, the Al-Nusra Front in Syria, you can find Saudi money behind all of that. And let's remember that 15 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11 were from Saudi Arabia. I'm not going to talk about the Saudi role in Yemen, because Rabia is going to speak about that. But I do want to mention that the Saudi monarchy not only represses its own people, but does repress its neighboring countries. I don't know, Rabia, are you going to talk about Bahrain at all? So one of the countries is Bahrain, where there was an Arab Spring and a very beautiful, nonviolent uprising of people in Bahrain to try to overthrow their repressive government. And as it started gaining momentum, the Saudis got very worried because they didn't want an example of a democratic country on their borders. And so they sent in the tanks to crush the Bahrain uprising. If you also look around the world, you see that the Saudis have been the major backers of the coup in Egypt that brought in the repressive Sisi regime. The Saudis rewarded the coup that led to the deaths of thousands of people, that led to the imprisonment of 40,000 people, rewarded them with $5 billion of Saudi government money. So there are many, many reasons for us to say that we should not have close ties with the Saudi regime. And yet, on the other hand, we see the Saudis investing their money in our system to try to give a happy face to the Saudis, hiring the most famous PR firms in the United States, including firms like the Podesta Group that's very close to the Clinton family, spreading the money out to foundations from the Clinton Foundation to the Carter Foundation. I mean, our lovely Jimmy Carter, that through his Carter Foundation does great work around the world, has a program to empower women and girls and takes money from the very country that so oppresses women and girls. Saudi money you can find in universities throughout the United States, especially in the Ivy League schools. You dig a little deeper and you'll find Saudis spending millions of dollars to have buildings named after them or programs named after them. So they have infiltrated our system. Saudi lobbyists are in the halls of Congress. Saudi lobbyists are meeting with our Congress people, our administration. And then there's the issue of Saudi weapons sales. Saudi weapons sales, the U.S. Sales to Saudi Arabia have been the largest weapons sales ever recorded in the history of the world. Over $60 billion of weapons sales. And those weapons sales have gone up tremendously under the Obama administration. In fact, 3 times more weapons have been sold to the Saudis under the Obama administration than under the Bush administration. And the US weapons manufacturers have been lobbying hard to sell more and more to the Saudis because it's huge profits. Well, in the past, the US alliance with Saudi Arabia was because of things like the huge profits in the weapons sales. It also was because of US reliance on oil. Now the US does not rely nearly as heavily on the Middle East for oil anymore. And it was also an alliance with Saudi Arabia to work together against a country that the US considered its enemy, and that's Iran. So I want to end by saying that there are other countries around the world, democracies, that are starting to question their relationships with the Saudis. For example, in Sweden, a foreign minister came into power with a more progressive government, and she said she was going to bring a feminist approach to foreign policy. It's not quite the Hillary Clinton approach to foreign policy. She was bringing a really, truly feminist approach to foreign policy. And she said part of that is to look around the world and see where are we promoting or not promoting women's rights. It's kind of funny because Hillary Clinton said she was doing that throughout the time that she was Secretary of State, but she was at the same time strengthening the relationship with countries like Saudi Arabia. Well, this Swedish foreign minister said, I don't think it makes any sense, and it makes us tremendous hypocrites if we in Sweden are selling weapons to a country that is so repressing its own people, and particularly the women. So she vetoed the Swedish weapons sale to Saudi Arabia. It created a big backlash internally in Sweden because there were a lot of business people who said, hey, wait a minute, you've gone way too far. And in Saudi Arabia, so it is a terrible precedent. They recalled their ambassador, they stopped giving out visas to Swedish citizens. It has caused a huge ruckus. But it is an example of somebody who comes into power really standing for what they believe and knowing that there are consequences to that. And right now we have a situation in the UK where groups are stronger than our peace groups, and they are questioning the UK relationship, and especially the weapons sales, to the Saudis. You might know that the great labor leader and anti-war activist Jeremy Corbyn has become the head of the Labour Party in the UK. And he has been against this close relationship with the Saudis. And there has been pressure from the anti-war groups in the UK. And finally, just this week, the foreign minister has been forced to say that they are going to look into the possible war crimes that Saudi Arabia has committed in Yemen, and this will inform their policies around continued weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. So these are tremendous developments, important developments, exciting developments, and developments that should really make us get inspired to do more, to question our government, to pressure our government, and to start creating a wedge between the US government and the Saudi government.
You know, a lot of people don't know anything about Yemen, you know. It's this poor country on the border of Saudi Arabia. It's a 3,000-year-old civilization with a beautiful culture and deep history. It did not, as Saudi Arabia, like overnight come out of the desert with oil money. We have a rich history and a rich culture. Unfortunately, in the past 50 years, mostly since the 60s and 70s with the oil explosion in Saudi Arabia, There's been, Yemen has been going through a lot and has a lot to do with Saudi intervention in Yemen. As you can imagine, Yemen, from all the Gulf monarchs, is the only Republican country at that time. I mean, before the 1962 revolution, northern Yemen was ruled by the imams for almost 1,000 years. It was like a feudal system. But in 1962, there was a coup, and Imam Yahya had passed away, and the Republic of Yemen was formed, and it was the only one in the Arabian Peninsula. And then in 1967, in South Yemen, you've got the Marxist, the communist South Yemen. At that time, they were not unified. They were two different countries, and the British had just left. So you had this country in the midst of these monarchies, like extraordinary wealthy monarchies, populous, poor, Republican, and there was, with all its, it was kind of dysfunctional at the same time. There was, reporters can actually say something, women can drive. We had, they had elections even if they were corrupt. I mean, it was very different from all the other, Gulf countries. And so Saudi Arabia, for a long time, tried to play the South and the North against each other, them equal, to keep them not one dominating over the other, just to protect their own interest. And then in 1990, with the unification of the North and South, the Saudis supported, of course, the South, and they supported all the opposition, and they do this all the time. Right now, they're supporting Islam, always involved in every, I would say, from the smallest issue to the biggest issue in terms of foreign policy when it comes to Yemen. And this has a lot to do also with the border we have. We share one of the longest and the largest borders in the world, Saudi Arabia, almost 1,000. I don't know how long. It's very long, and it's undefined. And Saudi Arabia in 1932 actually took over Najran and Asir, which is now under Houthi control, by the way. And here's another thing, because people don't understand who the Houthis are. Houthis were not exported from Iran to Yemen, okay? Houthis are Yemenis from the north. They're Zaydis. They are kind of aligned a bit towards the Shia worldview, but they are, Yemen is kind of different than Syria in many ways. I mean, Zaydis and Shafis have lived in Yemen for thousands of years together, coexisted. We didn't, sectarianism was not an issue in Yemen as it is in some parts in the other parts of the Arab world. But this is something that the Saudis use all the time. Oh, the Iranian intervention in Yemen, the Iranians are like, when in fact Obama was interviewed by Thomas Friedman like in March or so, and he spoke about intelligence that clearly shows that the Iranians had very little to do with the Houthis' expansion into Sana'a, the capital, and into the south. That it was actually a mixture of a weak government at the time, Hadi's government, and now the entire Saudi intervention was supposedly due to we're trying to put the legitimate government of Yemen back in power, which is Hadi. That was not the case. The Houthis were kind of given a free, they were allowed to go into Sana'a. There was nothing stopped them. And even though Iran might give them, there is some sort of like support financially or whatever, it's very, very little, and it's a lot more political conflict within Yemen that could have been contained if not for the intervention in March, which majorly, turned the conflict into a much bigger issue than what it could be today. I mean, it's 1,000-fold worse, with the Saudi intervention. And so I want to talk about what's happening today in Yemen. It's first of all, Yemen is a poor country. We had our infrastructure was already weak. There was the security system was not there. And now, you can imagine, with the internal conflict and the Saudi blockade on top of that, and airstrikes almost on a daily basis in every part of Yemen. It's not just in the north. Most of the deaths and the destruction in the south, by the way, in Aden and in Taiz now, is caused by Saudi airstrikes. Okay, it's not by the internal conflict. 5,500 people have died. The majority of them have died because of the Saudi airstrikes. And this is the destruction and death. Now let's talk about the Saudi blockade. The Saudi blockade, which is on every front, land, sea, and air, for 8 months now, to a country that that relies 90% of the food that comes in, which is wheat and rice, is imported. It's not, it's not in the, it's not grown in the country. So a lot of this necessary, like medical supplies and food, is imported from other places. Now, when you have the Saudis bombing ports like in Hodeidah, where this food is supposed to arrive to more than 25 million people, we are facing a catastrophe in Yemen. We are one step away from a famine in Yemen because of the Saudi blockade. And why did the Saudis? Why is this blockade? Well, yeah, we want to stop the Iranians from arming the Houthis. Really? A collective punishment of 25 million people, starving millions of people, just so that you can stop some arms from... Yemen is full of arms. Oh my God, Ali Abdullah Saleh, for 33 years, he's had Saudi arms, I mean, the country's full of arms. It's just ridiculous, this logic, It's inhumane, and what's really sad is that the world is, like Medea was talking about, the Saudis have bought people left and right. Their money is bought, they've silenced everyone. Just like the Saudis, it's not just in Yemen that this is happening. The Saudis are, for me, I see them as the biggest danger in the region. And it's not Iran. No way is it Iran. That's crap. Don't ever believe that crap. I'm a Yemeni and I'm not even Zaidi. And so it's not because I'm Shia, because I was actually, in the beginning of the Arab Spring in 2011, the top activist against the Saleh regime. And now I'm, just because I'm against what's happening with the Saudi intervention, they're like, oh, so you're Afashi now, oh, so you're now supporting Saleh. Has nothing to do with Saleh, okay? This is 25 million people under siege, okay? This is an entire country that they've destroyed everything, whatever little we had already, they've completely destroyed it, the Saudis. And there's no justification whatsoever for what's happening in Yemen. So, I don't know what else to say. Just want to thank you all, and I hope that we can just keep on talking and doing more. And this alliance, this evil alliance needs to end. And I'm
That's it. This is Stanley Heller for The Struggle.